Hey guys, welcome back. Go ahead, dim the lights, stretch a bit, and get comfortable. Because tonight, we're gently sinking into one of those topics people can't stop arguing about. Even after 5,000 years, no alien conspiracies or YouTube capital letter clickbait required, just the slow, sandy story of the pyramids of Egypt. Not the romanticized kind where the sun sets perfectly behind the Great Pyramid while some travel vlogger dramatically exhales. No, we're going deeper into the weirdness, the stubborn vanity that shaped them, the contradictions that stacked those stones, and the ancient logistics that somehow worked without a single Excel spreadsheet. Take a breath. Long ago, in a land that believed death was basically an all-expense-paid trip as long as your tomb was big, enough a handful of kings decided to immortalize themselves by building giant geometric mountains out of limestone in the open desert. Because, of course, they did. Let's drift back to around 2600 BCE. The air is hot enough to fry a desert beetle. Egypt is ruled by the 4th dynasty, a proud family of god kings who apparently looked at a sand dune and thought, yeah, this could use more limestone. Sitting on the throne as King a cheerful overachiever in the pharaoh department, Sneferu, bless his eternally preserved heart, was obsessed with one thing: getting that perfect pyramid shape. He didn't care that pyramids weren't even a thing yet, that's just a detail. His architects were still figuring out how to make a tomb that didn't look like a collapsing layer cake, but Sneferu wanted perfection, which meant trial and quite a bit of error. So he started his reign with enthusiasm and some questionable physics. His first big project, now called the Medum Pyramid, started life as a step pyramid, basically a stack of rectangular platforms getting smaller toward the top. Somewhere during construction, someone, probably Sneferu himself, decided that steps weren't classy enough. Smooth sides, he must have said, like the sun's rays reaching down. Very poetic, very expensive. The problem was, adding smooth faces meant filling in the steps with tons of stone. And physics didn't like that. The outer layers started sliding off like melted icing, and the structure partially collapsed even before Sneferu had time to show off to the gods. But he didn't give up. No, this man was committed to geometry, so he ordered a new one. At Dasha, a little further north, his architects, still nursing migraines from the first fiasco, tried again. They started steep then. Halfway up, realized the whole thing might cave in. Because of course, it might. So, in panicked compromise, they changed the angle. That's why the bent pyramid, well, bends. It's basically the world's first oops in stone. Halfway to the heavens, it just shrugs and says, never mind. Still, Sneferu wasn't done. After 2 near catastrophes, he finally got it right with the Red Pyramid. So named not for any romantic reason, just because the limestone has a pinkish tint, but it was the first of its kind. Smooth-sided, symmetrical, triumphant, the ancient version of finally getting your IKEA furniture to stand without wobbling. By the time Sneferu passed away, he'd created not 1, not 2, but 3 pyramids. A sort of grand obituary carved in stone. Historians sometimes call him the father of the pyramids, which is a polite way of saying he kept trying until something didn't fall over. Now, enter his son, Khufu, or as the Greeks later called him, Kia, the man behind the Great Pyramid of Giza, which, yes, you can still see standing there today, looking smugly perfect. Khufu inherited his father's ambition, but none of his patience. He wanted something so monumental that it screamed divine authority, a mountain for his eternal ego. And according to every ancient source, including Herodotus, Khufu wasn't exactly a warm, fuzzy personality. In fact, he's portrayed as a bit of a tyrant, the kind of guy who'd look at his workforce and think they could definitely move heavier stones. The Great Pyramid was his attempt to outdo every pharaoh who came before and did work it. For nearly 4,000 years, it remained the tallest structure in the world built without wheels, cranes, or power tools. Just a staggering number of people with ropes, sledges, and probably lifelong back pain. So how'd they actually do it? That's where the modern confusion begins. Forget the idea of alien tractor beams. History gives us something far stranger: logistics, combined with sheer human determination. The ancient Egyptians planned everything like a divine checklist. The stones came from nearby quarries, mostly fine white limestone for the casing, and heavier blocks from quarries. Workers cut them using copper chisels, pounding stones, and persistence that can only come from lifetime employment under a sun god. The completed blocks were dragged on sledges over paths possibly slicked with wet sand, which made the load easier to pull. Yes, wet sand. Archaeologists actually tested this and found that moistening the sand reduced friction dramatically, almost cutting required manpower in half, which means somebody, 5,000 years ago, accidentally figured out an early version of Physics 101, and then spent years putting it into practice. Still, that doesn't explain the construction technique. How do you raise 2 million limestone blocks, each weighing a few tons, into a pyramid almost 150 meters high? The most accepted theory is ramps, long sloping ramps built and rebuilt as the pyramid grew. Not a single kind, mind you. There were straight ramps, zigzag ramps, and spiral ramps, and Egyptologists still debate which one was actually used, because the builders didn't leave a handy how-to tablet behind. Recent discoveries, though, add more texture to the picture. In 2013, archaeologists found fragments of papyrus in an ancient port called Wadi el-Jaf. They belonged to a man named Mira, a kind of foreman in charge of transporting huge stone blocks by boat down the Nile from Tura. Imagine it, a 4.5-year-old work diary describing daily deliveries for the Great Pyramid project. Mira's notes casually mention moving limestone to Akhet Khufu, the horizon of Khufu, which was the pyramid's ancient name. He writes of docking at the harbor near Giza, reporting to his boss, and then ferrying stone toward the construction site. And that, honestly, turns the mythic mystery into something beautifully mundane, a bureaucratic project, complete with schedules, shipments, and managers. It wasn't a civilization of mystics building monuments under alien light. It was a nation of organized, sunburned employees doing their jobs. Contrary to popular myths, those workers weren't enslaved masses whipped by merciless overseers. Excavations of worker villages nearby show proper housing, bakeries, medical care, and even the occasional beef ration. They were laborers, but they were valued ones, skilled artisans, and seasonal peasants working to earn glory and beer rations, because in ancient Egypt you could quite literally be paid in bread and beer. These were national projects to honor the pharaoh, believed to guarantee the kingdom's divine order, so people joined the effort proudly, even when that effort involved dragging limestone for years under the sun. As for the Great Pyramid itself, its precision still amazes modern engineers. The base covers 13 acres, each corner aligned perfectly with the cardinal points. The sides vary in length by less than a few centimeters. Its orientation to true north is more accurate than most modern compasses. And all that without GPS Khufu, as engineers carved internal chambers and passages with eerie mathematical proportion. The King's Chamber, built from enormous granite blocks, hauled all the way from Aswan, almost 800 kilometers of... Those granite beams weigh up to 70 tons each, and somehow they're perfectly positioned above one another, forming a structure that's lasted through earthquakes, looters, and curious tourists knocking on walls. There's even an air of architectural trolling about it all. Later pharaohs tried to match Khufu's grandeur, but never quite succeeded. His son, Jitifa, attempted something smaller, but added a twist. He built his Atabur higher up the plateau, so it looked taller from a distance. A royal attempt at forced perspective. Khafre Khufu's other successor built the second pyramid right next to his father's, plus the famous Great Sphinx. The Sphinx, smugly staring across Giza, has confused people for millennia. Half lion, half man, all mystery. Some say it represents Khafre himself. Others think it's a slightly egotistical guardian. Either way, no ancient record actually calls it the Sphinx. That's a Greek name, retrofitted much later. The Egyptians probably called it something closer to Horamakhet, meaning Horus of the horizon. Notice a pattern. Everything's about horizons. The sun, rebirth, eternity. All the metaphors you can imagine baked into rectangular stones. But for all the divine talk, these were still deeply human projects. You can imagine the supervisors pacing around, the architects sketching revisions on papyrus, the workers gossiping about the latest decree from the palace. Maybe they cursed the heat. Maybe they sang rhythmic chants to pull in unison. Because what else do you do while dragging Teuton blocks for a decade? And as bizarre as it sounds, the Pyramid Age didn't last forever. After the Old Kingdom, Egypt slowly abandoned the practice. Later pharaohs built smaller tombs, then underground ones like in the Valley of the Kings. Apparently the lesson eventually sank in. Giant tombs near Cairo are basically just giant "rob me" signs. Still, those earlier kings got what they wanted. Permanence. Their pyramids became silent testimonies to obsession, mathematics, and the weirdly comforting human desire to last forever. Now, is it unfair to think of Khufu and Snefru as the original micromanagers? Probably not. Ancient records already imply Khufu was strict, maybe even cruel, with his people. There is a story that he locked away Egypt's temples to force the population to work on his project. Whether that's true or not, it fits the theme. He was the kind of pharaoh who built a perfectly symmetrical ego monument, and probably complained if one stone was out of alignment. Even Herodotus, writing 2,000 years later, couldn't resist a little gossip. He claimed Khufu forced his own daughter into disgrace to pay for more stones. A scandalous rumor probably made up by later Egyptians, who resented his austerity. But still. It's a story that fits the bedtime tone of well. Of course he did. Let's drift for a moment to the night over Giza, thousands of years ago. No tourist lights, no sound and light show, no city noise in the background, just stars, sand, and 3 perfect triangles cutting into the horizon. Somewhere deep inside one of those, an eternal royal sleeps, surrounded by sacred texts, tiny statues, and jars full of what he'd need for his trip to the afterlife, because heaven, apparently, demanded good housekeeping. By now, the monuments look timeless. But the truth is, each of those stones hides generations of exhausted effort and fragile human vanity dressed up as cosmic destiny. We'll drift a little deeper next into the hidden corridors. The strange writings, the weird experiments of later pyramid-obsessed rulers who couldn't quite capture the same magic. Let's float onward to the next disaster of divine architecture. All right, let's keep floating. The lights of Giza dim behind us. Now 3 immense silhouettes fading into starlight. The Old Kingdom had peaked, and the golden glow around divine kingship was starting to flicker. It turns out that building mountain-sized tombs for every monarch wasn't a sustainable business model, even for ancient Egypt. You could call this next era the downsizing generation. Imagine a line of royal accountants gently coughing in the background while someone proposes another 2 million block pyramid. The cost, the labor, the logistics, even Egypt's gods might have sighed. By the end of the 6th dynasty, around 2200 BCE, the government had stretched itself thin. The economy wobbled, the Nile's flooding pattern got weird, and the pharaoh's once absolute authority began fraying. Local governors, called nomarchs, started acting like independent probably enjoying the sudden freedom to build their own fancy tombs without royal oversight. That political unraveling led to what historians nickname the First Intermediate Period, which sounds like a gap year for civilization. Central authority collapsed, trade faltered, and pyramid construction. It all but stopped. The few tombs built during this time were little more than glorified hills of mud brick, eroded beyond recognition. The dream of perfect geometry was replaced by the reality of famine and divided kingdoms. But ancient Egypt had a strange kind of resilience, almost like it knew how to hit reset. Around 2050 BCE, a ruler from Thebes named Mentuhotep II decided he'd had enough of local governors pretending to be kings. He reunited the country, established what's now called the Middle Kingdom, and rebranded himself as the restorer of divine order. Of course, with unity restored came the irresistible temptation to dust off the old playbook. build pyramids again, because what better way to shout Egipte's bike than with a brand new tomb rising over the desert? Mentahotep's burial site at Deir el-Bahari wasn't quite a pyramid though. It mixed architecture and natural cliff face, part temple, part terrace, part mountain. It was a conceptual step toward the complex mortuary temples that would dominate later eras. He was perhaps quietly admitting that the days of pure pyramid mega-projects were gone. Still, the symbolism lived on. Then came the 12th dynasty, Egypt's middle management, legends of the afterlife. These pharaohs, notably Amenhotep I and his successors, revived pyramid building in earnest, but something was different. The towering stones of Giza were replaced by, let's call them, Bajito-ware pyramids. Amenhotep I established a new capital called Ich-Tayi, near the Fayoum oasis. His pyramid, at Lisht, looked promising when finished, smooth sides, bright limestone casing, elegant but beneath that pretty surface lay a heart of mud brick rubble held together by limestone blocks. The result, structural disappointment. Over time, those pyramids slowly melted into shapeless mounds. You can almost imagine future travelers squinting at them centuries later and saying, that used to be something grand, right? Why the downgrade? Well, resources had changed. Stone quarries near Giza were largely exhausted, and centralized manpower wasn't what it used to be. Egypt was still powerful, but more pragmatic. These kings focused on administration, literature, and irrigation, less on gigantic eternal tombs, yet the pyramid tradition held symbolic power. Each ruler still wanted that eternal connection to the sun god Ra rising over their house of eternity. The problem was getting engineers to produce monumentality on a budget. Amenhotep's successor, Senusritai, tried to refine the design tighter limestone casing, better foundation, but he faced the same material issues. His pyramid at Lisht shows signs of clever reworking, but even that eventually slumped inward. Jumbling geometry, in the soft Egyptian light, has its own melancholy beauty, like watching ambition sag under the weight of time. Senusrit III, often seen as one of the most capable Middle Kingdom rulers, tried moving his pyramid complex to Dashur, an almost nostalgic return to Snefru's old territory, as if chasing ancestral glory. His tomb's interior, though, grew increasingly complex. Multiple chambers, hidden passageways, trap-like corridors, a sign of Egypt's growing paranoia over tomb robbers. Because yes, by now, grave robbing was practically an industry. The pyramid's bright surfaces were irresistible, glowing markers of buried wealth. You couldn't ask for better advertisements for burglary. The 12th dynasty architects fought back with cunning. They buried trapdoors under sarcophagi, created false passageways, hid entrances under staircases, and carved decoy tombs deep within the sand. But like the world's longest-running chess match, robbers eventually learned each move. By the reign of Amenhotep III, around 1850 BCE, things got a little eccentric. He built two pyramids, one at Dashur, which promptly developed structural issues, and another at Hawar, famous for its attached mortuary temple known to the Greeks as the Labyrinth. That labyrinth apparently baffled visitors, even in the ancient world. Herodotus, who saw it 2,000 years later, claimed it was more impressive than all the pyramids combined. Its countless rooms, passages, and hidden chambers were meant to confuse spirits and bandits alike. Or maybe it just confused the architects. The pyramid next door, meanwhile, used a limestone core so poor that it began collapsing during construction. So much for eternity. Amenhotep III's pyramid, at Hawara Maitav, been flawed in engineering, but conceptually, it carried the legacy. This was the end of grand stone pyramid building in Egypt. Later kings of the Middle Kingdom built small, symbolic versions, barely visible today, before the tradition faded. Why abandon something so iconic? Several reasons. For one, everyone finally realized pyramids were terrible security concepts. The moment you build a mountain-shaped beacon over your tomb, you're basically saying, hey, priceless stuff here, please dig underneath. So, the new kingdom rulers, beginning around 1550 BCE, went underground, literally. They shifted their burials to the Valley of the Kings, carving elaborate tombs deep into cliffs, invisible from the surface. It was a smart move, though also a quietly sad end to a 2,000-year experiment in stone-based immortality. But before we rush ahead, let's pause on the cultural side. Even as pyramid building declined, the Egyptian worldview around death and eternity kept evolving. The pyramids weren't just royal tombs. They were cosmic metaphors. Their angled sides symbolized sunbeams. The very word for pyramid in ancient Egyptian mer meant the place of ascension. When you stood at the base, looking upward under the blazing sky, you were meant to feel the path of the pharaoh's soul rising to join Ra, sailing eternally across the heavens. So when later kings stopped building them, it wasn't out of rejection. It was the priesthoods grew stronger, the religion more complex, and the afterlife became less about architecture and more about sacred texts, the coffin texts, and later, the Book of the Dead. Those carved prayers replaced stone geometry as the ticket to eternity. Still, the fascination never faded. Even small tombs kept echoing the pyramid shape. And the benben, that little pyramidion stone that once capped great monuments, became a symbol on temple obelisks. Many pyramids appeared as decorative features, little reminders of the time kings once believed they could literally build forever. Let's drift for a moment. Imagine an Egyptian scribe sitting under a fading evening light, writing hymns about houses of eternity long after the last pyramid builders had packed up their copper chisels. He'd still see those silhouettes on the horizon, dusty but divine. Silent proof that even crumbling ambition outlasts ordinary life. And now, fast forward again. Millennia later, Greeks, then Romans, stumbled through Egypt and stared at those stone triangles, completely guessing how they were made. They saw them not as tombs, but as mystical relics. By the time Herodotus strolled through Giza in the 5th century BCE, the world had already lost the knowledge of Egypt's own engineering. He described the pyramids with awe, mixed with confusion, saying thousands of slaves toiled under cruel kings for decades, which, to be fair, makes for a good story, even if archaeology has since ruined his drama. The pyramids became symbols of exotic mystery, used by poets, philosophers, and later conquerors to measure their own mortality. It's kind of ironic, really. Monuments designed to ensure a single man's immortality ended up making us remember the anonymous workers far more. The Middle Kingdom's tired pyramids, half buried in sand, only deepened that sense of melancholy. They remind us that eternity might be achievable in stone, but not in memory. Time erodes both. And yet, here we are still talking about them, tracing their outlines in moonlight, wondering how blocks of limestone turned into something closer to myth. Because, somehow, they did it. Without machines, without iron, without magic, just through determination and an almost poetic stubbornness that believed death could be tamed by geometry. Let's float a bit further, next into how the pyramid idea traveled the world, haunting other civilizations that never met Egypt, but still felt drawn to that mysterious shape. Let's float a little now, over the deserts, past the Nile, S-winding shimmer, into the wider ancient world. Because, here's a curious thing. Egypt wasn't alone in this architectural obsession. Somehow, without WhatsApp or trade manuals, other civilizations across the planet all thought, you know what looks divine? A big triangle built upward. Coincidence, collective psychological quirk, or just human beings realizing the easiest way to make something look important is to stack stuff until it impresses you? Whichever way you call it, the result was the same. Everywhere, someone was building a pyramid. Our first stop, ancient Mesopotamia, the land wedged between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Long before Egypt's pharaohs were worrying about limestone, the peoples here, the Sumerians, and later the Babylonians, came up with something slightly different, but spiritually related. Now, the ziggurat isn't technically a pyramid. It's more of a step tower, a kind of massive, terraced platform that said, "We're closer to the gods than you." No smooth sides, no secret tomb chamber, just a grand staircase for heaven. These structures rose above their flat plains, like mountain substitutes, since Mesopotamia didn't really have the real thing. If Egypt built tombs for divine kings, Mesopotamia built stairways for divine landlords. The earliest known ziggurat was built at Ur, around 2100 BCE, for the moon god Nana. Picture it. 3 main levels. Baked bricks, stacked high, smooth white plaster gleaming in the sun. Staircases leading straight into the sky. Priests would climb up daily for rituals, offerings, or possibly dramatic photo ops that, sadly, no one had the camera for. Unlike the Egyptian pyramids, though these weren't burial sites, no pharaoh buried under tons of stone, the ziggurat was more like a cosmic Wi-Fi tower, connecting heaven and earth. Its name in Sumerian probably meant something close to temple on high, which is poetic enough to survive thousands of years. And yes, if the description sounds oddly familiar, that's because the biblical Tower of Babel myth likely came from memories of one of these giant stacked bricks reaching toward the sky. Humanity's overreaching the same old theme, just told with divine science. But let's not linger in Mesopotamia too long, because, on the other side of the world, another civilization was quietly doing something uncannily similar without ever hearing of the Nile. Ra, or Sneferu's geometric experiments. We're heading west, way west, across oceans and centuries, to Here, among the tropical jungles and high plains, the Olmecs, the Maya, and later the Aztecs all built their own stone mountains, pyramids with steps, temples on top, and ceremonies that definitely didn't involve quiet meditation. The Mayan pyramids, rising out of dense green forests, look like Egypt's spiritual cousins, but the reasons behind them were very different. The Maya weren't burying kings underground, they were lifting temples upward. Their pyramids were designed as platforms for rituals, astronomy, and sometimes dramatic reenactments of myths involving maize gods and celestial snakes. Tikal Castillo, at Chichen Itza, also called the Temple of Ku, built around 1,000 years ago. It's an architectural calendar disguised as sacred geometry. Each side has 91 steps, and counting the top platform makes a total of 365. During the spring and autumn sunlight falls on the staircase to form the illusion of a serpent slithering down the pyramid's side. Symbolism, precision, spectacle, 3 ancient obsessions in one. Other Maya sites, like Palenque or Tikal, built pyramids surrounded by lush forests, part of sprawling city complexes, rather than isolated monuments. Their builders didn't crave eternal solitude like the Egyptian pharaohs. Their pyramids pulsed with life, ritual, and noise. Meanwhile, further north in Mexico, the city of Teotihuacan, already ancient by the time the Aztecs arrived, held 2 vast pyramids, the Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon. Together they formed the city, a symbolic axis, standing guard over the Avenue of the Dead, which is possibly the most dramatic-sounding street name in human history. Nobody knows what the original builders, probably not the Aztecs, but an earlier civilization, actually called these pyramids. What we do know is that they were massive. Their surfaces once painted bright red and adorned with murals and obsidian decorations that glittered like stars. And legend has it, the Pyramid of the Sun was built over a cave that symbolized the birthplace of the gods. You can almost imagine the ritual torches, the shadows moving across the steps, the slow beat of drums echoing upward toward the stars. If Egypt's pyramids embodied divine order, eternal stillness, Mesoamerica's pyramids embodied divine rhythm, sunrise, sacrifice, season, and rebirth, strategy and spirituality, all choreographed in stone. It's haunting, really, how different cultures took the same geometric shape and wrapped it in entirely different meanings. The Egyptians said, "This is the pharaoh's gateway to the afterlife." The Mesopotamians said, "This is where the gods touch earth." And the Maya added, "This is how we keep the universe running on schedule." But it doesn't stop there. Let's wander southward now, down through Nubia, in modern Sudan. Most people don't realize it, but the land of Kush, Egypt's southern neighbor and sometimes conqueror, ended up building more pyramids than Egypt itself. Yes, really. Around 200 or so still stand in places like Meru and Nuri, smaller, steeper versions of their northern counterparts. The Kushite kings of the 8th century BCE admired Egypt's grandeur so much that they basically said, "We'll take the look, thanks." When these rulers took control of Egypt during the 25th dynasty, they brought the pyramid tradition back to life. For the Nubians, pyramids were symbols of royal legitimacy, connecting them spiritually to ancient pharaohs, but with a style distinctively their own. Taller, thinner, with small chapels at the base for offerings. These weren't colossal mega-projects, but elegant geometric tributes to a shared idea of eternity. Some still holds painted reliefs showing queens and kings receiving life from Anubis or Isis thousands of years after. Egypt's original pyramid age had ended. By the time the classical world rose, Greece, Rome, Persia, pyramid building had become more memory than practice. Still, the fascination lingered. The Greeks wrote about them with hushed reverence. Romans toured Egypt like history nerds on sabbatical, carving graffiti on the stones. Everyone wanted a taste of that ancient authority. Even a few Roman nobles built miniature pyramids for themselves, the most famous being the Pyramid of Cestius in Rome. A sort of pharaohcore fashion statement from 18 BC, you could say the pyramid had gone global and then turned aesthetic. In later civilizations, the pyramid became metaphorical, an image of perfection, hierarchy, and immortality. Renaissance artists drew divine triangles in their paintings. Alchemists filled notebooks with pyramid diagrams. And centuries later, Freemasons adopted it as a symbol of knowledge ascending toward illumination. Not bad for a design that started as a very fancy tomb. But the real twist is that, across cultures, building these monuments was less about religion and more about reassurance. They were acts of control, solid, geometric comfort in the face of chaos. Whether it was the flood-prone valleys of Mesopotamia, the unpredictable jungles of Mesoamerica, or the endless sands of the Nile, humanity kept stacking stones upward, maybe to prove that the world could make sense in straight lines. Of course, none of them lasted unscathed. Sandstorms eroded them, plants crept over them, tourists chipped at them, and yet they endure. Because stone dreams move slower than time. Even now, satellites can trace their alignments, lines of forgotten precision cutting across landscapes that have long forgotten the hands that built them. Let's linger a bit longer on that image. The shared geometry of human longing, the same triangular silhouette rising from Egypt's golden desert, from Sudan's red earth, from the green heart of Guatemala. Three edges, one idea. You could call it the quiet pulse of eternity, expressed in limestone and volcanic rock. Every culture, in its own sleepy madness, looked upward and decided to shape the sky with stone. And it's tempting, at the end of all this, to think the question, how were they built, might never be as important as why they had to be. Because maybe, floating beneath all the calculations, alien theories, and measurements, the pyramids, in every corner of the world, were just humanity's way of whispering to the universe. We were here. We mattered. We tried to make forever. Let's drift onward next, toward the rediscovery. How? Explorers, treasure hunters, and 19th century romantics stumbled over these silent giants and turned them into the stuff of myths, curses, and tourism brochures. Let's float forward again, thousands of years, through the quiet hum of time. The winds keep shifting, dunes rise and fall, and the old pyramids just wait. They don't rush. They've survived floods, kingdoms, and 1,000 sunsets. So when humanity eventually returns to pry at their secrets, you can almost imagine the stones sighing, "Oh, you're back." By the 1st century CE, Egypt had become a museum with live-in caretakers. Greeks settled there, then Romans, then Byzantines, layering their architecture and languages over the ancient dust. The old pharaonic religion was long gone. Its temples stood as curiosities or convenient quarries. And the pyramids, they were mostly legendary. The people who lived near them simply accepted them as part of the landscape. The hills built by the ancients, half buried, half divine. The Great Pyramid of Khufu still jutted from the desert, but much of its smooth limestone casing had been stripped away by later builders. Cairo, or what would become Cairo, was growing not far away, its mosques and palaces built from the very stones that once shimmered under Ra's bright sun. A little recycling project. courtesy of eternity. By the Middle Ages, the pyramids had entered folklore. Arabic writers swapped theories, ranging from the charming to the bizarre, that the pyramids were granaries built by the prophet Joseph, or time capsules filled with all of human wisdom to survive a coming flood. Travelers described them as fortresses, observatorios, or storage halls for arcane treasures no one really knew, and that ignorance gave them magic. Fast forward to the 12th century, a Kurdish general named Saladin, who eventually became Sultan of Egypt, even tried mining the Great Pyramid for hidden gold. His workers chipped away an entrance through the north face, and found nothing but old stone and confusion. Their accidental tunnel, carved over 800 years ago, is still how most tourists walk into it today. The Great Mystery. Apparently, emptiness, which, in its own way, feels perfectly Egyptian. The centuries rolled on. Europeans, drunk on crusades, relics, and legends, began writing tales of desert giants built by magicians or demons of the East. The Actua builders, those bronze-skinned workers who hold ancient limestone, had faded entirely into myth. All that remained were shapes against the mist. The modern rediscovery, or at least the modern obsession, began with Napoleon. Not the romanticized art thief Napoleon of memes, but the real one, methodical, ambitious, and always ready to bring home souvenirs. In 1798, he landed in Egypt with not just soldiers, but over 100 scientists, artists, botanists, and mathematicians. An entire Enlightenment expedition disguised as a military campaign. Napoleon himself, standing before the pyramids near Giza, supposedly told his troops, "From the heights of these pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon you." It's a famous line no one can prove. He actually said it. But it's possibly the first time anyone turned ancient architecture into motivational wallpaper. His scholars, meanwhile, got to work, sketching, cataloging, measuring every ruin in obsessive detail. This massive project became the Description de l'Egypte, a many-volume encyclopedia published in elegant French typography, filled with engravings so precise you can almost smell the dust between the pages. It was the Enlightenment's love letter to the ancient world. The marriage of curiosity and colonial flair. And that's really when everything changed. Western Europe discovered Egypt in earnest. The pyramids, once silent under centuries of sand, began their second life as objects of fascination, envy, and sometimes exploitation. Explorers came armed with measuring rods and early theories about geometry, astronomy, and divine mathematics. Romantic poets came too, scribbling about the melancholy of immortality. The pyramids became backdrops for books, paintings, and midlife crises. The 1800s were a strange era for these monuments. Some visitors saw them through scientific eyes. Others treated them like cosmic puzzles. Everyone had a theory. Some believed they encoded prophecies of the apocalypse. Others claimed their dimensions matched the Earth's curvature, proving divine inspiration. A few eccentric Victorians even convinced themselves that the Great Pyramid was built by biblical patriarchs, naturally, from the pre-flood civilization that did everything first. Meanwhile, the desert began giving up its secrets in less poetic fashion. Early archaeologists, or treasure hunters, depending on how polite you want to be, started tunneling, blasting, and prying open tombs. Giovanni Battista Belzoni, an Italian strongman turned explorer, lugged mummies and statues through narrow passages, leaving graffiti that still reads. Belzoni made this. Subtlety was clearly not a requirement in early Egyptology. The Great Pyramid, surprisingly, revealed no golden treasures. Khufu's sarcophagus chamber was mostly empty. No body, no grave goods, no mysterious relics, just echoes and red granite. And that emptiness baffled the Victorians, who loved mystery but hated antiquity. So they filled the silence with theories. Secret chambers, hidden tunnels, invisible doorways. To be fair, centuries later, scanning technology would detect voids and corridors inside the pyramid structure, proving there's still hidden architecture no one fully understands. But back then, it felt personal. The pyramid refused to explain itself. By the mid-19th century, Archaeology gained something like professionalism, though the line between discovery and plundering was still blurry. Tombs were opened, bodies unwrapped, amulets collected, and papyri shipped to European museums, still quietly bragging about them today. The pyramids themselves became the ultimate tourist destination, travelers posing on camels, buying scarab and congratulating themselves for touching history. Of course, the actual Egyptians, watching from nearby villages Mutav, rolled their eyes a little. To them, these monuments weren't rediscoveries. They had never been forgotten. The locals had always known their presence, their stories, even their ghosts. It was only foreign eyes that called it a discovery. Still, as the world industrialized, the Great Pyramid's timelessness became strangely comforting. A fixed point in an age of revolutions and railways, writers used it as shorthand for endurance. Empires came and went, limestone stayed. Tourists carved initials inside it, but the walls barely noticed. Queen Victoria's soldiers posed at its base. The pyramid just kept aging gracefully. Then came the 20th century, and the inventions of flight, photography, and cinema, all of which turned the pyramids from silent giants into global celebrities. Suddenly, you could see them in postcards made of cheap paper, tiny replicas of eternity printed for pennies. Archaeology matured to Howard Vyse, the British officer who bored gunpowder holes into the Great Pyramid in the 1830s, had been replaced a century later by meticulous excavators with notebooks and fine brushes. The tone had shifted from let S blast a hole through history to let S take notes and not step on the pottery. Improvement, at least in manners. Modern Egyptology learned to read hieroglyphs thanks to the Rosetta Stone discovered, fittingly enough, by one of Napoleon's soldiers in 1799. That single slab of text became the key to translating an entire civilization's silence. Over time, archaeologists realized that pyramids weren't built by divine command or aliens. They were built by people, ordinary, skilled, endlessly patient people with calendars, payrolls, and sorebacks. By the mid-1900s, the Great Pyramid was no longer mysterious in the supernatural sense, but it remained haunting. The more we understood, the stranger it grew. Why were its angles aligned with such absurd precision? Why did its inner chambers resonate at certain frequencies? Why was it mathematically perfect when its builders had no modern tools? Maybe, as one wry Egyptologist once said, they didn't have our technology, but they didn't have our distractions either. Today, after 5,000 years, the Great Pyramid stands alone, stripped of its casing, scarred by time but somehow more honest for it. The smaller pyramids nearby, Khafre's, Menkauer's, stand like siblings, aging in different moods. Together, they form Egypt's slow heartbeat. Still, enduring, unbothered by the noise of drones and tour buses. And maybe that's the final irony. The very thing built to immortalize individual kings ended up erasing them, turning them into background scenery for eternity. People remember the shape, not the man. Khufu, Sneferu, Khafre, they became whispers beneath geometry. If you've ever stood before the Great Pyramid at sunset, it feels like listening to silence that once had a pulse. The stones don't explain. The air doesn't respond. But you somehow understand anyway. Because, in the end, the pyramids didn't merely survive. They kept their secret. That eternity is just repetition. The endless rising of the sun, the endless curiosity of humankind, the endless question of how. And after all the centuries, here we are still asking, still building towers of glass, steel, and ambition, still chasing immortality, one design at a time. Maybe that's the true echo of the pyramids, not stone, but the refusal to stop reaching upward. So, tonight, as the desert cools and the last light slides across the limestone edges, remember these the pyramids were never a mystery waiting to be solved. They were a story waiting to be remembered. Now, let's drift away from Egypt for a while, and maybe next time we'll find our next bedtime ruins. Somewhere else, the sands of time never quite stopped whispering. Let's sink back into the desert for a while. The tourists have gone. The floodlights are off. The wind moves through the sand with that soft, endless hiss. The Great Pyramid sits there, massive and unimpressed, as satellites orbit far above it, still studying its angles, still scanning its insides. Because 5,000 years later, humanity hasunti stopped asking, how? The irony is that we've measured the thing down to the millimeter, and it only gets stranger. The Great Pyramid is aligned to true north, with an accuracy that even modern surveyors would envy just 3/60ths of a degree off. That's less than a human hair per meter. And it is. Not just north. Every side corresponds almost perfectly to the Earth's cardinal points. If you tried to improve on that without Google Earth, you'd have a breakdown. How did they do it? Well, scientists have come up with a few solid, less extraterrestrial answers. One involves watching the stars. The ancient Egyptians were dedicated. They followed the stars' circumpolar paths, the ones that never set beyond the horizon. By observing where specific stars crossed during rotation, they'd mark a perfect axis. In other words, they looked up, not down, to build the most precise structure on Earth. Some Egyptologists even suggest they used the star pair Kakab and Mizar, circling around the northern pole at around 2500 BC. By lining up the edges of the pyramid to where those two stars crossed one another, they could trace a pure north-south line. Elegant, low-tech, cosmic. Still, the results are so exact that many modern engineers blink and think, really, it's as if the builders combined sky geometry with an artistic obsession for straightness that bordered on supernatural patience. Then, there's the scale. Let's revisit the numbers with calm. The Great Pyramid originally rose about 146.6 meters high, roughly a 45-story building. Its base stretched over 230 meters on each side, each facing stone fitted so precisely that, in some parts, you couldn't slip a credit card between the joints. The entire structure weighs an estimated 6 million tons, and remarkably, it didn't crumble. Not sideways, not inward. Even after thousands of earthquakes, dynasties, and British curiosity, it just sat there, slightly eroded but structurally sound. The reason lies in its design. Each layer slightly smaller than the one beneath, distributing weight evenly. It is ancient load-bearing mastery, the kind modern engineers keep testing in models and quietly nodding at. But then there's the stranger side, the whispers of the pyramid power. It began in the 20th century, long after serious archaeology had found its footing. The claim was that the pyramid's shape itself had mysterious effects, that within its geometry, something invisible, energy, magnetism, vibration, was circulating in harmony. It supposedly preserved food, sharpened blades, calmed human emotions, maybe even mummified fruit. It sounds absurd, but the fascination caught on. Writers and hobby scientists built small pyramid models and placed razors, apples, or dead flowers inside, claiming miraculous preservation. Tere were even pyramid sleep experiments, suggesting you could rest under a cardboard pyramid and achieve deep meditation. Actual science, of course, found no measurable mystical energy. Yet the persistence of such legends says something deeper, that human beings still want a spiritual explanation for cold geometry. The lines are too neat, the shape too timeless. It feels wrong for it to be only math. We crave meaning and symmetry. Even respectable physicists can't resist the pyramid's quiet magnetism. In 2018, a group of researchers at ITMO University in Russia published a study showing that the Great Pyramid's structure could theoretically focus electromagnetic energy, not magic, just physics. Their model showed that certain wavelengths might resonate inside the chamber geometry, creating localized energy concentrations. That doesn't mean the ancients knew they were building a natural antenna, but it does mean this shape, pure, stable, and linearly perfect, interacts with physics in delightful ways no one quite expected. The same symmetry that balances stone also balances fields. And so, we orbit between the measurable and the mystical, between copper chisels and cosmic resonance, between the practical genius of workforce organization and the idea that something in this architecture harmonizes with the Earth itself. Meanwhile, back in the world of archaeology, the mystery continues on more grounded terms. Modern scientists have turned to drones, infrared imaging, and muon radiography, a particle scanning technique that reads dense structures like X-rays on a cosmic scale. In 2017, such scans revealed something remarkable: a large, unexplored void above the Grand Gallery inside the Great Pyramid. It is vast, roughly the size of an airplane fuselage, and no one knows exactly why it is there. It could be a relieving cavity built to distribute weight, or it could be another undiscovered chamber. Either way, the pyramid keeps its habit of revealing just enough to remind us that we still don't know everything. And that's the funny part. We have satellites reading distant galaxies, but we're still guessing about a pile of limestone blocks we can walk directly into. Some modern engineers have tried recreating small-scale models, like Mark Lehner's experimental pyramid projects, proving that with basic copper tools, sledges, and manpower, you can indeed move and align massive stones without any extraterrestrial forklift. The logic is simple. If you give enough humans enough bread, beer, and motivation, they can move the world. Another enduring theory revolves around water. Some researchers argue that canals and flooded trench systems might have been used to float blocks partway, reducing friction and manpower. It sounds elegant and faintly comedic to imagine the world's largest engineering project as a series of very slow boat rides. Still, even these concrete theories don't fully erase the aura of mystery. Maybe it's because the pyramids were never meant to be understood. Their builders weren't trying to impress engineers. They were trying to communicate with eternity, and eternity doesn't write manuals. So when people today talk about pyramid power, maybe that's just the emotional residue of what these shapes were originally meant to do. To make you feel small, still, and strangely safe under something older than history's memory. It's fascinating to think that, after millennia, the pyramid continues to function, not as a tomb, not as a monument, but as an emotional machine. You stand before it, and your sense of scale collapses. All your timelines from your alarm clock to your deadlines vanish. You're just part of a continuum of people who've stared at it and whispered some version of the same thought. How? And that's its secret, isn't it? Not the mechanics, but the humility. Its power isn't that it hides something, it's that it doesn't need to. Each face catches the sunlight at a slightly different hour. Each shadow slides across the sand like the ticking of an eternal clock. Even stripped and cracked, it still performs its only true function, to outlast wonder itself. Maybe that's the point. The pharaohs understood better than we do. They didn't build perfection because they expected to be remembered. They built it because they feared being forgotten. And somehow, in that fear, they found the formula for timelessness. So, the next time someone says, "We'll never know how they did it," maybe the pyramid is quietly laughing in limestone, saying you already do, you just don't believe in patience anymore. Now, let's rest softly on that thought for a moment. The desert night deepens, starlight paints the edges of the stones, and the silence hums with a geometry too slow for words. This is where science ends and reverence begins. So, everywhere. We've drifted through dust, dynasties, myths, and measurable stones. And somehow, the Great Pyramid still stands there, quietly ignoring us. Maybe that's the real trick. All our theories, all our documentaries, the laser scans, and drone footage, none of it changes the pyramid. It has absolutely no opinion about us. It doesn't care whether someone believes aliens built it, or whether we debunk alien builders. It doesn't care that Napoleon camped in its shadow, or that cameras now hover above it. It's still doing exactly what it set out to do: sit, endure, and wait. The truth is, pyramids weren't made for the living. They were meant for that uneasy pause between life and eternity, for the belief that death can be organized, that chaos can be shaped. And when the pharaohs built their tombs, they unknowingly built something larger, the human ideal of permanence. Because if you peel back the stone, the precision, the myth, what's left is strangely familiar. It's the same impulse that makes someone carve their initials into tree bark, or save photos in the cloud, or build a glass skyscraper and call it progress. Everything we make is an attempt to whisper, "Remember us." The Egyptians just did it with better project management. The pyramid wasn't just architecture, it was memory solidified. Every limestone block was a thought about time, placed deliberately, layer after layer, rising toward eternity. The workers carving those stones probably didn't think of immortality while hauling ropes in the sun, but collectively, they built something that outlived their entire civilization. That's almost cosmic irony. The anonymous hands built immortality for someone who eventually became anonymous himself, and yet, maybe the pharaoh's name doesn't matter anymore. Maybe the monument doesn't belong to him. Maybe it never did. Somewhere along the line, the king's eternal house became humanity's reflection. That's the strange transformation of history. Every empire eventually becomes everyone's heritage. When you stare at the Great Pyramid today, you're not seeing divine power. You're looking at skill, rhythm, and calculation, at the beauty of organized chaos, repeated millions of times until it becomes serenity. There's something hypnotic in that balance. The pyramid is both unbelievably complex and perfectly simple. A triangle anchored to earth, pointing to sky geometry at its most meditative. You can't really feel time inside it. The air tastes old, dry, and metallic. Steps echo like heartbeats against the granite. Light doesn't travel, it creeps. Every sound flattens into silence, as though even echoes are shy here. Standing in those narrow, sloped chambers, you don't feel smaller, you feel temporary. The pyramid doesn't make you feel inferior. It reminds you how light you are compared to stone. When Herodotus visited, he called them eternal. When Napoleonist scholars studied them, they called them miraculous. When we map them today, we call them structural wonders. But from their perspective, if stone can have a perspective, they're just there. Time doesn't pass for them the way it does for us. It just accumulates, gently, like sand on their sides. And that's the strange comfort of it. For all our obsessions with how they were built, maybe the pyramid's real secret is that they don't need to mean anything. They were built out of faith, effort, and absence. Faith that work outlasts the worker. That symmetry outsmarts death. That precision can turn grief into geometry. We still chase the same illusion, just with different materials. We build cities that light up the night. We create data clouds and digital archives, stacking information like limestone blocks. We pour concrete instead of limestone, glass instead of granite. The materials change. The species' behavior doesn't. Maybe one day long after we're gone, our towers will crumble and turn into sand too, and some future species will stare at the remains of our glass pyramids of commerce and whisper their own questions into the silence. Why did they build this? Who did they think they were? And maybe one of them will find an old recording. A voice, slow and sleepy, talking about pyramids, and wonder at the same thing. That's the real through line of history. Curiosity doesn't die. It just changes shape. The pyramids made sure of that. So, as the night deepens, picture the desert again. No noise, no flashlights, just the wind brushing over sand, sliding against those stone edges that have been there longer than almost any human language. Above, Orion hangs exactly where the Egyptians saw it. The stars blink the same way they did when the first stones were laid. And the pyramid, with that eternal patience, continues its conversation with the sky, uninterrupted, unreadable, utterly still. If forever had a sound, it would probably sound like this moment, a soft hum of sand, and the quiet breath of something that refuses to end. So, sleep. Now the pharaohs will keep their watch. The stones will keep their secrets. The geometry of forever doesn't need solving tonight. It just needs to be heard. Good night, traveler. In time, we've come full circle, from dust to monument, from monument back to dust. And somehow, the silence in between still feels like eternity. Everyone, go ahead, dim the lights, grab whatever passes for comfort, and settle in, because tonight we're not talking about grand empires or famous kings. We're going somewhere smaller, stranger, quieter, a place the Romans listed on their maps, somewhere north of Macedonia and south of total confusion, the land once called Dardania. Now, if you're already squinting at the screen, wondering where on earth that was, don't worry, you're not alone. Even ancient geographers had trouble pinning it down. It sat roughly where Kosovo and parts of North Macedonia are today, a hazy mountain region wedged between Illyrian tribes and Macedonian kings who alternated between raiding it and pretending to own it. Dardania was that rocky inland cousin at the family dinner of ancient civilizations, partly Thracian, with a sprinkle of Greek influence whenever traders wandered up the valleys. And yet, somehow, like every ancient society, they made time for festivals. Because, of course, they did. You can spend your whole existence herding goats and dodging Roman tax collectors without occasionally stopping to drink and pretend the gods are listening. So, tonight we drift through those old Dardanian rituals, half pagan, half political, and entirely human. A fated landscape where mountain spirits, fertility demons, and war deities all shared the same calendar. Let's start with what little we know and what we can guess. Because the Dardanians didn't exactly leave behind handy festival brochures, most evidence comes filtered through their neighbors. The Greeks who saw them as wild highlanders, the Macedonians who raided them, and the Romans who eventually absorbed them into the empire and renamed everything to sound fancier. But piecing together fragments, inscriptions, Roman officials' complaints, and a few legend echoes, we can see that the Dardanian year revolved around three things: war, harvest, and wine, the holy trinity of survival in the Balkans. Their major celebrations seem to have aligned with seasonal changes, particularly spring, and late autumn, when both the land and the people came up for air from either fighting or farming. At those times, the mountain passes, filled with processions, torches, flutes, a lot of shouting, and a general disregard for moderation, which, to be fair, puts them in excellent company with nearly every ancient culture ever. Spring was dedicated to what later Romans identified as a local fertility goddess, somewhere between Demeter and the local earth spirits. Offerings of grain, fruit, and small clay figurines have been found at what archaeologists think were rural shrines near the upper Ibar Valley. You can almost picture it: priests or village elders standing before a rough stone altar, goats decorated with flowers, people singing as fires crackle behind them. The Dardanians believed the land woke up angry after winter, so part of the ceremony involved soothing it, sprinkling grain in the fields, throwing milk or honey on rocks, and dancing barefoot in circles until exhaustion or enlightenment set in. The Romans later described this with their usual mix of awe and condescension, calling it rustic superstition, which is academic Latin for these people party weird. Another spring ritual centered around ancestor offerings. At dusk, families gathered near burial mounds, lit small fires, and left bread or cups of fermented mead. The act wasn't about mourning, it was hospitality, inviting the dead to join the living for one night of music and memory. The smell of smoke, rain-soaked earth, and wine mingling in the mountain air, that was Dardania's idea of family reunion. Oddly enough, this tradition lingered well into the Christian era in the same region, just renamed for saints and angels instead of spirits. Human habits outlive theology every time. Then came midsummer. Halfway through the year, when the valleys turned gold and the warriors usually returned from raids or border skirmishes to spend their earnings on something other than swords. Midsummer was loud, hot, and surprisingly democratic. Everyone joined the feast: warriors, shepherds, and occasionally captured traders who might have preferred not to. Songs about bravery and loss filled the nights, and the wine flowed until diplomacy became optional. A Roman chronicler from the early imperial period notes, with a mixture of alarm and fascination, that Dardanians honored the sun with fire that never dies, probably an exaggerated description of bonfire rituals celebrating the longest day. People lit torches and carried them across fields, symbolically burning away evil spirits, or depending on the mood, just showing off their lung capacity. The fire festival also had an unnerving feature. They occasionally drove horses through the flames, a display both ritualistic and reckless. Horses were sacred to many Illyrian tribes, representing strength and luck. The Dardanians believed that sun-blessed horses brought victory, and honestly, what's one night of terror for a lifetime of good fortune? Ancient practicality was a flexible concept. Let's glide now toward autumn, where most Dardanian festivals seem to have peaked emotionally. Harvest meant relief, safety, and a good excuse for gratitude. Their main celebration probably took place around the equinox, again syncing with other Balkan peoples, marking the end of reaping and the storing of grain for winter. Archaeological finds near Prisina show shards of pottery etched with spirals and goat motifs, probably used in these domestic libations. The goat was a recurring offering, sacrificed not just for food, but as a conversation piece with the gods. Its horns, cleaned and hung at doorways, symbolized prosperity, kind of like hanging up Lucky Charms, except far louder and messier. One particularly odd festival that Roman sources tried to describe, but couldn't quite categorize, involved the Dance of Masks. Women and men both wore animal skin masks, wolves, boars, somatimus rams, and circled the village boundary through the night, chanting rhythmic phrases to keep away unseen forces. It was equal parts theater and exorcism. Performers sometimes jumped out to scare children, which, judging by human patterns, means it was everyone's favorite part. But beneath the playfulness, these rituals had depth. Dardanians lived in a harsh landscape shaped by cycles of scarcity. Winters were brutal, politics often bleaker. The festivals weren't just entertainment. They were survival psychology, an annual rehearsal for hope. When you can't control weather or war, you control rhythm. You decide when the year ends, when it restarts, when you dance. Now, a quick detour into their relationship with wine, or what passed for it. Illyrian vineyards weren't exactly France, but local production thrived along the valleys feeding into the Vardara and Moreva rivers. Archaeologists found amphora fragments, showing Dardanian trade with coastal Greek colonies, so they clearly knew their reds from their regrets. Wine was sacred, social, and medicinal, often mixed with herbs or honey. One early Hellenic visitor admired how these tribes turned bitterness into laughter by cup, which is a poetic way of saying they could outdrink their guests with gracious precision. Even after Roman conquest, local artisans kept producing ceremonial drinking vessels, some with engravings that look suspiciously Dionysian vines, wild animals, ecstatic dancers. Historians debate whether this was imported Greek influence, or just humanity's universal excuse to make alcohol a personality trait. It's easy to imagine a Dardanian festival evening. The smell of roasted meat, the hum of flutes, shadows moving around a bonfire, and bursts of laughter fading into deep chanting as stars thickened above the valley. Somewhere nearby, a storyteller recites old myths about gods who lived in clouds, about ancestors who turned into rivers, about kings who learned humility only after death. The themes repeated endlessly, but nobody minded. Repetition was comfort. Their myths, incidentally, leaned dark. The Dardanian pantheon, as far as we can reconstruct it, didn't believe in gentle gods. There were war deities with multiple names, local protectors of rivers, eerie mountain mothers who granted fertility in exchange for tributes. A relief fragment from southern Kosovo shows a female deity holding both a serpent and a loaf of bread, nurturing and terrifying at once, much like the environment itself. Festivals to such gods weren't always joyous. Some were an uneasy truce, a promise not to anger what couldn't be tamed. And yet, through all the strangeness, what stands out most is the endurance of joy. People still sang, still painted their faces, still brought out whatever instruments they could cobble from reeds and bone. They danced with the same energy you'd find in a crowded tavern centuries later, that primal defiance of despair by rhythm alone. When the Romans finally annexed Dardania, somewhere in the 1st century CE, they integrated local feasts into imperial religion, renaming the deities, tightening the rituals, scheduling them under city calendars. You know, the standard Roman approach to culture. Conquer, then brand. The fertility goddess morphed into a provincial version of Ceres. The fire rituals rebranded under the cult of Solon. The people went along with it, because adapting old traditions was easier than losing them completely. Even under Roman rule, archaeologists find small household shrines, maintaining the older practices: carved stones, with sun symbols, animal figurines buried beneath thresholds, traces of milk offerings. The empire could rename the festivals, but the mountains kept their own memory. And that, in a way, defines It was indeed an empire, or even a proper kingdom most of the time. Just a collection of valleys with stubborn continuity. When foreign armies marched through, the locals still lit their fires at the solstice, still offered honey to their spirits, still believed that sound and celebration could keep the world from falling apart. It's a strange comfort, knowing that these forgotten Highlanders measured time not with empire politics, but with laughter, shouting, and smoke under the stars. Because that's how most of history's uncivilized corners worked. They never bothered with time, just with seasons, stories, and maybe one too many cups of festival wine. Let's float forward, slowly, into the next section, where conquest reshaped those traditions, and Dardania's ancient festivals quietly merged into Roman and early Christian rhythms, blurring gods and saints until no one could tell one from the other. Let's pick up the thread. Imagine the wind moving over Dardania again, carrying the same songs it's carried for centuries. But now, there are Latin voices in the mix. Roman merchants, Roman soldiers, Roman tax officials, and behind them, Roman priests. The empire has arrived, and with it, the polite insistence that everyone do things the Roman way. Festivals included, of course. Roman governors didn't exactly forbid local customs that would have been messy, and they were allergic to unnecessary rebellion. Instead, they did what all good empires do. They merged things, gave the old gods Latin aliases, rebranded tribal feasts as civic festivals, and gave the fire dancers a permit, more or less. The Dardanians, being practical people, just nodded and carried on. The old hilltop ceremonies became proper feriae, Latin for public festival days. Their fertility goddess, the beloved Dardania, became associated with Ceres, the Roman goddess of harvest. A neat translation. Never mind that the original deity probably preferred milk and honey to Roman incense, as long as she still got her offerings. Everyone was happy. Temples started appearing along Roman roads, small shrines at first, half local, half imported. Archaeologists have found inscriptions dedicated to Jupiter of Scupieme, or their Scupi, and later to Jupiter Dardanicus, a distinctly regional version of the sky god. It's classic Roman administrative religion. When in doubt, make a divine merger. Even their war rituals got polished. The chaotic horse-burning fire festivals turned into military commemorations. Legionnaires stationed in Dardania likely joined in, reshaping it as a celebration of victory rather than harvest. Parades replaced tribal dances, and altars were built in stone rather than raised from earth. But somewhere behind all that new marble, the old rhythm remained. The sound of drums, the scent of grain fire. There was still a spring festival, though now it bore a Latin name, Furia Solia. It honored the sun's rebirth, marked by outdoor feasting and communal games. Records from the nearby province of Mysia mention races, animal sacrifices, and, perhaps unfairly, music of the rustic style, which probably means loud pipes, drums, and the kind of joyful chaos Rome liked to call barbaric charm. The Romans, predictably, brought wine by the barrel, with vineyards extending into the valleys. Local productions merged into imperial trade. Dardanian hills that once hosted tribal feasts now supplied amphorae of red wine stamped with Latin coin marks. The blessing of Dionysus or Bacchus, take your pick, spread upward, intertwining with older mountain spirit legends. You'd walk into a Dardanian household by the 1st century CE and find statues of Roman deities neatly arranged on small shelves. Jupiter, Fortuna, maybe a local nymph figurine tucked behind them for luck. Religion had become bilingual. And yet, behind all that borrowed divinity, the Dardanians kept their oldest habit, celebrating together when they should have been working. Romans were baffled by the sheer number of feast days mountain communities insisted on observing. A letter from a frustrated provincial governor in the 2nd century CE mentions the tribes of the Dardanes neglecting civic function for prolonged rites of Thanksgiving, which sounds suspiciously like a bureaucratic complaint about locals throwing too many parties. Those parties, by the way, had shifted tone. They were now performed openly in the forums of new Romanized towns: Nisus, Scupi, Ulpiana, The Dardanian year had gained structure, festivals aligned with imperial holidays. The Floralia in spring, dedicated to flowers and fertility. The Saturnalia in winter, celebrated across the empire with reckless abandon and very little self-control. Did the Dardanians truly adopt these festivals, or did they remodel their own customs to fit them? Hard to say. Saturnalia's chaos, gift-giving, costume play, inverting social order, probably appealed to them instantly. After all, it wasn't far from their older solstice feasts, where masters and servants danced together and everyone pretended life was on to mostly toil. Still, one thing changed quietly. Sacred authority moved from the hills to the cities. Priests who once served nature gods were absorbed into local cults, sometimes as state servants. Dardanian women, once central to fertility rituals, found their public religious roles trimmed down a subtle Roman habit. A few carved reliefs show priestesses holding grain bundles, veiled in the Roman style, their faces still wild-eyed in that older, freer way. It's civilization by costume. At the same time, Christianity was starting to whisper its way through the empire's back roads. By the 3rd century CE, preachers from Macedonia had made their way north, calling themselves apostolic wanderers. In provincial towns like Illyrian, small Christian communities took root quietly at first, meeting in houses, avoiding conflict with the old gods. To the Dardanian mind, though Christianity must have looked like one more layer in a long pile of divine systems. A new god on the mountain of old gods. When missionaries spoke about resurrection, locals probably nodded and said, "Ah, yes," like our spring goddess, while secretly planning her annual festival anyway. Conversion rarely happens by deletion. It happens by translation, and Dardania, being at the edge of everything, was already fluent in translation. During this late phase, festivals start blending memory and ritual almost seamlessly. Take the midwinter feast, once about the solstice fire, now dressed up as a civic celebration of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. By the 4th century, as Christianity rose under Constantine, ironically born not far from these regions, that feast morphed again. Ask a villager what they were celebrating, and you'd likely get a shrug and a line about the birth of light, which, within a few decades, meant Christmas. No cultural overhaul is ever total in the Balkans. People simply rename the gods and keep cooking the same meals. By late antiquity, the same valleys where ancestral fires once burned now glowed with Christian candles. But the rhythm was suspiciously familiar. Singing, offering food, drinking, wine praising, rebirth. The details changed, the longing didn't. Festivals honoring the dead have evolved, smoothly transitioning from ancient rituals to what we now celebrate as All Souls' Day. Inviting ancestors to the fire has just evolved into fresh blessings. People prayed to saints instead of whispering to spirits. You can still spot traces of it in Balkan traditions, today candlelight vigils and shared meals for those we've lost, blending mourning with memory. And what about the old festival music? That too survived in odd places. Ancient flutes became shepherd pipes, war drums softened into folk rhythms. By the time the empire fractured, the sound of Dardanian celebration had faded into folklore, no longer state events, just local recollections. The hills remembered them quietly. So, step back for a moment. By late antiquity, the festivals of Dardania had done something miraculous. They adapted through empires, religions, and centuries without ever being written down. They moved by habits, not record. A song here, a fire there, a grandmother's story told next to a bowl of wine. When scholars centuries later look for Dardanian culture, they find no scriptures, just continuity disguised as coincidence. That's the trick of forgotten civilizations. They don't vanish, they blend. Their festivals keep happening under new names, in new languages, convincing everyone they're something else. So when early Christian monks in the 5th century recorded the region-esque customs with dismay, people celebrating saint days with dancing, feasting, and bonfires, they were unknowingly documenting the survival of Dardania's ancient year. The same circle of fire that began before Rome still flickered, though now blessed instead of feared. Let us drift forward next, into the late Roman and early Byzantine centuries, where these hybrid festivals evolved once more, surviving invasions, plagues, and theological debates, turning into the early medieval rhythms that still echo faintly in Balkan folklore today. The world changed again, as it always does. Empires cracked, borders blurred, and one morning the Empire of Rome woke up, calling itself the Empire of Byzantium. To Dardania, it didn't look much different. Soldiers still marched through the same roads, taxes still arrived on time, and the hills still smelled of smoke every spring. What changed most wasn't the people, it was the stories they were told to believe. Christianity, now imperial and confidant, moved steadily into Dardania's mountains. Bishops replaced governors. Churches rose on the ruins of older shrines, built from the same limestone blocks that once walled off sacred groves. The message was simple enough. The old gods were gone. Saints had taken their jobs. And yet, for the mountain villages, that wasn't a problem. They'd been through worse cultural transitions. They simply nodded, changed a few names, and kept lighting their bonfires. The spring festival of the Earth Goddess, for instance, the one once dedicated to Dardania, found a new spiritual supervisor, Sanpara. She was a convenient choice, a saint of healing, purity, and the natural world. In the 6th and 7th centuries, Byzantine missionaries spread her cult throughout the Balkans, and the locals adopted her like an old acquaintance with a new outfit. Every year at planting time, families offered loaves of bread and honey before her icons, much like their grandparents had done before, nameless stones. Even the rituals looked suspiciously familiar. Processions continued, now led by village priests instead of tribal elders. They sang hymns instead of chants. Though, if you listened closely, you could hear the same rhythm, the same pulse that once summoned spring. The priests probably suspected the resemblance, but decided it was best not to ask. In midst, like Elijah, fiery, tempestuous, residing somewhere between heaven and thunderclouds, conveniently replaced the older sun gods. His feast day, Illyrian, became synonymous with storms, rain, and good harvests. Villagers still lit torches, now to honor the prophet. But the fire dance, that wild circle leaping through flame, stayed right where it was. Byzantine chroniclers often complained about superstitions of the Dardanoi, people who crossed themselves before sacred wells or tied ribbons on oak trees for luck. But the empire was vast, and enforcement fatigue is real. As long as local bishops reported baptisms, Constantinople didn't have time to chase every dancing peasant around a bonfire. The festivals slowly became bilingual, Christian in language, pagan in ritual. A curious text from the 8th century mentions that in Upper Mysia, the broader region covering Dardania people celebrated saints' feast days, wheat singing, pipes, and rural games. That's polite Byzantine Greek for bonfires, wine, and communal chaos. Even funerary festivals survived, only now they were framed as memorial services. In spring, families visited graves, carrying bread, candles, and watered wine. The priest would say prayers for the souls, and afterward, everyone would share the food under an open sky. It wasn't a funeral anymore, it was ancestry as community. The logic hadn't shifted since pagan times. The living feed the dead, so that the dead protect the living. The fact that the conversation now happened in Greek instead of Illyrian was just administration. Across the region, relics of saints took over the old terrain of mythic ancestors. In earlier times, mountains had their guardian spirits. Now, every monastery claimed a local one. These saints absorbed the emotional territory once ruled by nature gods. The cave that once held a spirit of fertility now held the relic of Saint Clement. The healing spring dedicated to a goddess now bore the name of Saint Nicholas. It's difficult not to smile at the efficiency. One empire, one religion, same rituals. Only the labels changed. Still, beneath Christianity's calm surface, older customs found new shadows. Take the wolf festivals. Before conversion, Dardanians celebrated late autumn with rituals to appease lupin spirits, protectors of herds and, paradoxically, feared predators. Hunters wore wolf masks, old at dusk, and left offerings of food to divert hunger away from their animals. Centuries later, local Christians commemorated St. Theodore's Day in almost the same way. Men disguised in pelts went door to door, with drums and singing, driving away the forces of evil for the winter ahead. The church said it was symbolic pure. The villagers called it tradition. In the Byzantine world, theology might have been strict, but rural life was flexible. The clergy tolerated local customs when they couldn't replace them. That is low. Cultural compromisi, the one historians politely label syncretism, is how Dardania made it through 1,000 years without losing its festivals entirely. The harvest feasts didn't vanish either. They became church fairs, panegyrics, named for patron saints. Every village had one. The grain goddess had become Saint Demetrius, keeper of fields. The wine offerings were poured for Saint Tryphon, now framed as the patron of vines and laughter. Once a year, after the last grapes were pressed, villagers would gather before the churchyard, light candles, roast lamb, drink, and pray for rain. It was a perfect merger of piety and nostalgia, half biblical, half bacchanalian. By the 9th century, the Byzantines considered Dardania completely Christianized, but if you'd wandered through the hill villages around Skopje or you'd notice something different. Christianity there looked remarkably old. Icons painted with local pigments hung beside carved wooden totems. Bells rang over fires that were meant to bless the earth. Children were told stories of saints who could turn into eagles, or whose tears became rivers myths that carried the DNA of older mountain deities. That strange hybrid spirituality survived because geography protects memory. The highlands were always hard to govern. Empires rose, but the hills stayed remote. The perfect sanctuary for awkward beliefs. Even centuries later, travelers through the Balkans remarked that old customs live as shadows among Christians. Picture a midsummer night in early medieval Dardania. On the edge of a Byzantine frontier village, a bonfire still crackles. Families move quietly through the dark, carrying oil lamps instead of torches. The priest blesses the flame. Children throw herbs into it for the saints. The stars above are sharp and endless, and the music still pipes and drums reverberates through the valley like an echo of the Bronze Age. It's not rebellion. It's routine. Humans can't forget what feels older than history. Over time, the festival calendar thickened again. Every Saint's Day became a reason to feast, play, dance, and forget the grind of life beneath empire. By the High Middle Ages, those saintly festivals had become the backbone of Byzantine rural identity. From the Dalmatian coast to Dardania's forests, Christian peasants still held spring mids and harvest celebrations that were, if we're being honest, more spirited than strictly theological. There's something tender in that transformation. Paganism didn't die. It was baptized. The same bonfires that once cooled down the sun now symbolized divine light. The same circle dances that once summoned fertility now decorated weddings. The same memorial feasts for ancestors became church-approved commemorations. Same acts, softer words. So when the Byzantine historians later looked back on Dardania and called it peaceful, faithful, and remote, what they really meant was this. The mountains had learned the empire's language, but they still sang their own songs. Somewhere above those hills, perhaps, the old gods didn't mind. After all, being remembered under any name was the whole point of a festival. Let's drift a bit further next into the later medieval era, where the world fractured, again under Slavic kingdoms and Ottoman frontiers, and those mountain festivals grew even stranger, half folktale, half Saviva ritual, still echoing the whispers of Dardania's firelit past. By the time Dardania faded from the imperial maps, the world had changed again. Asterisk, the Roman name dissolved, replaced by towns with Slavic, Byzantine, and eventually Balkan-sounding syllables. Kings came and went. Serbian, Bulgarian, Byzantine, again. And after centuries of this political back and forth, the people of the mountains did what they had always done, kept celebrating the seasons, and ignored whoever sat on the distant throne. Language shifted, the songs didn't. It's the 12th century now. Dardania exists mainly as a historical echo under the Kingdom of Serbia. The last trace of its Roman roads has turned into shepherd and the people speak a Slavic dialect, peppered with old Illyrian leftovers. In the isolated villages, festivals have once again gone local, stripped of official doctrine, refitted with folk meanings. If you could visit one of those villages around you'd find an event that looked vaguely Christian on the surface, icons carried in procession, church bells, prayers, but then the priest would step back, and the real show would begin. The fire jumping. Bonfires were lit at riverbanks, on hillsides, or even in courtyards. Couples leaped through the flames hand in hand. An axe still called by its old Slavic name, but older yet in spirit. The community believed it burned away sickness and misfortune, ensuring health for the coming year. The church had long given up trying to forbid it. It was simply absorbed, blessed at the beginning, sanctified by habit. That same night, villagers would leave food under fruit trees for wandering souls. The blessed dead, they called them now. The milk and honey of Dardania's ancient ancestor rites had become bread, cheese, and sometimes wine, wrapped in linen. It was less pagan now, more personal. People didn't say for the spirits, they said, for grandmother or for father. But you can spot the lineage if you listen closely. Feasts still aligned with some, though rebranded through saints' names. The spring plough blessing became St. George's Day Hergivden, still celebrated across the Balkans today. Its rituals, if you trace them backward, belong right here in ancient Dardania. Families decorated doors with green branches, bathed before dawn in rivers, and tied wreaths of wildflowers to their livestock. Symbolically pagan, verbally Christian, a holy compromise. The sun festival of Elijah the Thunderer, Illyrian, stayed wild. People still called him Old Perun behind the priest's back, the lightning god disguised as a saint. Thunderstorms around that date were considered both sacred and practical. Omens. Good rain meant happy crops. Thunder meant power. Silence meant worry. By the 15th century, the Ottoman Empire swept through. Minarets replaced bell towers. Churches turned into mosques, and the Christian calendar went underground for a while. Asterisk, but if history teaches anything, it's that you can't occupy. The weather and festivals, at their core, are about weather, harvest, and time. Even under Ottoman rule, Rural Dardania, by then, simply the mountain heart of the Balkans, kept its rhythm. Muslim settlers arrived with their own feasts, Mevlid gatherings celebrating the Prophet's birth, harvest blessings, and candlelit remembrance. Nights, and quietly, something remarkable happened. Instead of erasing each other, the traditions overlapped. In mixed villages, Christians and Muslims shared festival space, attending each other's feasts with small adjustments in formality. One week would honor a local saint with bread, the next a Sufi saint with prayer and song. Both sides lit candles. Both sides sang about rain. Both understood that some things were older than religion. Old Dardanian echoes were everywhere, hiding under new words. Asterisk, a musician playing the kaval flute at a saint's feast, unknowingly, repeating the same tunes shepherds used 3 millennia earlier. Children dipping wreaths into rivers on St. John's Day, a custom that once belonged to mountain water spirits. Women gathering herbs on Summer's Eve, the same herbs once burned in pagan purification fires. One Ottoman traveler in the 16th century, the chronicler Evliya Çelebi, remarked that in these mountain lands, the Christians and Muslims light fires on nights of the old moon, singing through the dark, as if to frighten the air itself. He didn't understand the custom, but you can almost feel the blend. Pagan silhouettes dancing in Ottoman twilight, still feeding a rhythm older than empire. By this time, if you'd asked a villager where these customs came from, you'd get a shrug. Asterisk, that's how it's always been. Asterisk. And that's usually how civilization preserves itself, not through books, but through shoulder shrugs and stubborn memory. Throughout the long Ottoman centuries, the festivals turned practical. The Dardanian calendar had become a framework of blessings. In spring, cleaning, planting, bathing rituals. In summer, music, fire, pilgrimage to holy wells. In autumn, harvest markets and feasts. In winter, storytelling gatherings by the hearth, drinking games, and animal sacrifices, disguised as charity banquets. The church, now shadowed but never quite gone, quietly blessed these events under saints' names whenever possible. The local hoshas or Islamic teachers sometimes participated, turning them into communal days of generosity. Even the idea of sacred ancestors persisted. Villages across Kosovo and southern Serbia practiced what's now called zadusnas, days for visiting graves with food, candles, and wine. Though framed as Christian memorials or Muslim charity, the ritual repeats, word for word, the old Dardanian pattern of feeding the dead so they'll bless the living. It's almost poetic. How I survived by not announcing itself. While Western Europe wrote down its myths and turned them into literature, the Balkans hid theirs inside habits. Lighting a candle became a conversation with gods who simply learned to answer in different languages. The Ottomans, to their credit, rarely interfered with rural folk customs, unless they threatened taxes or politics. So, the old rituals carried on through centuries of empire, a quiet pagan heartbeat under the formal call to prayer. Even today, you can trace those energies through Balkan folk festivals. The fire dances of Thrace still performed at St. Constantine's Day. The wreath-crowned rivers of Serbia and Macedonia. The masked winter parades where horned figures roar through mountain towns to chase away evil, called kukari, or Jamali echoes of Dardanian animal-masked exorcisms. Every year, without realizing it, the descendants of Dardania reenact their ancestors' calendar. They greet the spring with green branches, set fire to midsummer nights, share food with their dead in autumn, and tell stories by the hearth in winter. The names are newer. The rhythm isn't. What's remarkable is that these weren't revival movements. They never actually died. For millennia, through empires, conversions, invasions, and reforms, the people of this land just kept doing what made the seasons bearable. Celebrating. So if you walk today through a mountain village in Kosovo or southern Serbia on the eve of a saint's feast, you'll still smell wood smoke, hear the drone of flutes, and see firelight catching on the fields. The children racing around don't know they're part of something prehistoric. But the hills do. The hills always know. Let's drift one final time next, into the modern age, where scholars rediscovered these fragments, trying to trace the faint outlines of Dardania's forgotten soul and realizing, almost sheepishly, that it had never really vanished. The fires had burned for nearly 3,000 years. But by the time the 19th century arrived, most people thought Dardania was just an academic ghost, a name in Byzantine maps, half-remembered and half-erased. The festivals, of course, were still there. They didn't know. They were ancient. It was the age of curiosity. European explorers, with beards, notebooks, and a habit of poking around old ruins. The Ottoman Empire was shrinking. The Balkans were waking up to nation, and scholars suddenly started looking for roots everywhere. Everyone wanted an ancestry. And in those forgotten valleys of modern Kosovo and southern Serbia, they found songs, rituals, and dances that didn't quite fit with the neat Christian or Islamic calendars of the time. Field ethnographies in the late 1800s began describing odd rural customs that seemed to belong to another world. They wrote about peasants lighting fires at solstices, washing in cold river water before dawn on certain Wednesdays, and leaving food by oak trees. No one called it Dardanian. Of course, they just called it local tradition. Bate. Patterns were there, woven quietly through centuries of survival. One Serbian folklorist, Milaj Vasi, documented the persistence of spring rituals meant for the renewal of life. Another scholar from Shkodër noted northern Albanian tribes celebrating the fire festival, Shenjarje, Sanjorgasde, with goat sacrifices and river baths. The parallels were uncanny, Asterisk everywhere. The same story. Bonfires beside rivers, wreaths floating downstream, food shared with the night. What no one realized at first was how ancient those formulas were. They weren't imported Slavic customs or Ottoman leftovers. They were regional fossils, rituals so old that later religions had simply grown around them. By the early 20th century, archaeologists rediscovered traces of Dardania in the soil. The remains of shrines, altars, household figurines, broken pottery with spiral marks that matched those of later folk motifs. Villages' embroideries still use the same circular patterns you see on Bronze Age ceramics. The spiral of renewal, sun, and cycle. Asterisk. It wasn't nostalgia, it was continuity disguised as folk art. The Dardanian spirit had outlived its makers simply because no one told it to stop. In the interwar years, local ethnographies began making the connection. They started mapping Balkan festivals backwards, finding that the further you traveled into the mountains, the older the calendar looked. Some settlements still followed lunar timing for their feast days, refusing the solar precision of the modern state. If a saint's day fell wrong, they just moved it back to match the moon, because the moon had been the first clock anyway. Anthropologists saw fire-jumping ceremonies, processions of masked dancers in winter, and animal blessing rituals in spring. Different communities spoke different languages: Albanian, Serbian, Turkish, Macedonian, yet the choreography barely changed. The mountains didn't care who ruled them, they remembered by repetition. Even in the 1950s, Western visiting rural Kosovo noted these survivals. Torch, festivals for rain, communal plow feasts, bread baked in circular loaves and shared among neighbors to calm the earth. One reported the local proverb, "If the land isn't fed, it will eat the seed." Asterisk, that idea, feeding the earth, goes straight back to the Dardanian fields of the Bronze Age. 5. Millennia, same logic. Then came modernization. Trains, electricity, urban jobs, and the fragile continuity began to blur. Rural rituals turned into folklore performances, staged heritage, choreographed for festivals or tourists. But something about their rhythm still worked. Their songs were slower than modern ears expected. The steps moved in ancient time signatures. Asterisk historians call that temporal layering, when an old culture keeps breathing quietly under newer ones. In today's Kosovo and northern Albania, you can still find traces. Villages around Prizren hold midsummer gatherings by rivers and light fires to honor Saint Elijah. Communities in Montenegro climb hills at sunrise to greet the returning light. Families in southern Serbia visit graves with bread, candles, and wine during certain spring days. Each act carries the imprint of Dardania, Isolde calendar, those same cycles of planting, rebirth, and memory. They no longer belong to paganism or empire. They just belong to time. And maybe that's the point. The Dardanian festivals weren't designed to survive conquest. They were designed to survive despair. In hard climates, ritual becomes a language of endurance, an annual reassurance that life, in all its small routines, still beats back death. That's why the world's oldest traditions often come from its poorest mountains. When history forgets you, rhythm remembers you in the warm quiet of a Balkan summer night. You can stand on a hillside and still hear the patterns, the murmur of people preparing fires, the low hum of a flute, the shuffling of footsteps older than any church or mosque they pass on the way home. It's not ceremony anymore, not even superstition. It's instinct. The irony, of course, is that what modern archaeologists call revivals are often just continuations. The people of these hills never truly revived anything. They simply kept doing it. They celebrated while the empires argued. They danced through taxes, sermons, and reforms. They guarded joy by disguising it as duty. And now, centuries later, scholars stitch the timeline together. Ancient altars matched with modern customs, pagan gods replaced by saints, and agricultural blessings that still smell faintly of smoke and honey. The line is too blurred to call history a straight path. It's more like a slow circle of firelight. drawn in the dark over and over until it becomes familiar enough to ignore. So when we talk about the festivals of Dardania, maybe we're not talking about archaeology at all. Maybe we're talking about something deeper, something that can't be buried. It's the soft persistence of memory itself, the way a people can lose everything except the impulse to celebrate, the way a bonfire, once meant for gods, can warm children centuries later. In the end, the festivals of Dardania didn't disappear, they just aged into folklore, changed their names, and waited for us to notice. Somewhere out there, in the night breeze that moves across Kosovo's hills, the air still smells of smoke and distant laughter. Someone plucks a string instrument, someone lights a small fire, someone whispers a prayer they can't trace the origin of, and unknowingly, they complete the circle again. That's how eternity works. Quietly, locally, one fire at a time. So, rest now. The mountains have kept their promise. Asterisk, the songs of Dardania are still being sung, even if no one remembers who taught them. Asterisk in history, for once can afford to fall asleep. Asterisk, thank you for drifting through the mountains and centuries with me tonight. If you've made it this far, you've probably already forgotten the world outside your window. And that's exactly how it should be. The festivals of Dardania, like all the quiet rhythms of history, are best remembered in the half-light, when the mind is soft and the past feels close enough to touch. So rest easy, knowing that somewhere, in some forgotten valley, the old fires still burn, and the songs still echo, just a little louder than the silence. Good night, and sweet dreams.